Hello and welcome to another episode of the Agency Leadership Podcast. I'm Chip Griffin.
And I'm Gini Dietrich.
And today, I don't have a really exciting intro. I'm just going to say we're going to talk about employees versus contractors for agencies right after this. I had a big fat nothing today.
Yeah, I'm kind of surprised. There's no creativity coming out of you today.
No, it's kind of sad, and
It's because you used your segue, your creative segue in our banter beforehand. That's why.
That's true. I did, yes.
Yeah.
So, what are you going to do? It is what it is. I apologize to you listeners that we didn't give you the usual entertainment at the start of the show, but we might have some during the show because Ginny has some fun audience members who are wandering in and out.
Audience members in the form of children and dogs.
So if you hear something, that's what it is. But we're keeping our fingers crossed that all will be calm.
I did tell them, I said, I'm going to record a podcast, so go downstairs. So hopefully they understand that means do not come up here.
If I recall correctly, you told them that about 10 minutes ago, and they got noisier right after you.
That's fair. So. They were singing at the top of their lungs. So. But they did not come upstairs. So.
Okay. Well,
we'll see. Also, we gave up 10 minutes of recording time for that, so we should probably hurry.
Well, you know who can sometimes be like children?
Who?
Employees and contractors.
It's true. Yes, that is true. Mm-hmm.
It's not the best segue to the topic at hand, but I do often say that employees and clients at times are like children, and in some ways you need to treat them as such in order to get what you're looking for. We're not talking about that today, though. What we're talking about today is whether you should have employees or you should have contractors or you should have a mix, how you decide which you should have and when you should have them.
Yes. So I think it's important to start with what is the law, especially in your state.
The law? Come on, Jenny. Let's not get wrapped up in what the rules are.
Come on.
Let's just do what we want.
Let's follow the rules. I'm a rule follower. I'm an oldest child. That's what I do. I follow the rules. So what is the law?
Well, it depends on your state.
Sure.
But in general, there's a whole series of tests. So if you Google, there are plenty of tests that you can look at that look at different criteria for individuals to see if they qualify, in the United States at least, as an independent contractor. And some of the key things that you need to look at are whether that individual is out there and actually trying to operate their own business, whether it's freelance or otherwise, right? So if you are their only client and they're not trying to find any other clients, chances are they don't qualify, right? Typically, you have to give them flexibility over when, where, and how they perform their work. In other words, you can give them a project assignment or something like that, but you can't say, typically, I need you in the office from 9 to noon, 3 days a week or something like that. Unless it's for particular meetings, obviously you can require their presence at particular meetings and that kind of stuff. But in general, you can't tell them, where they are and what to do. And most importantly, generally speaking, almost every state will frown on contractors who do the core business of your business. So if I'm a media relations agency, hiring a contractor who does media relations is a trickier sell if you're ever audited than hiring a graphic designer.
Correct.
Or a web programmer or something like that, right? So generally speaking, the further away the skill is that you're hiring for that is outside of the main thing that you sell your agency as doing, the safer you will be. It doesn't mean that you can't have someone who's working on the core portion of your business. You just have to be a whole lot more careful with the other criteria and really understand, because some states, it's just black and white. Like if in California, and again, I'm not, as I always say, I'm not a lawyer, an accountant, a tax, blah, blah, all that kind of stuff. But if you're in California, you do not want to hire a contractor who walks, talks, and looks like an employee. That is not good.
Yeah. And so I think it's really important to understand your state requirements, and also understand, if you're hiring contractors in other states, understand those state requirements. So I tend to shy away from hiring contractors in California for that very reason. Because they are very strict on what your contractors look like, and tend to audit smaller companies for that reason. So I tend to stay away from California as much as I can, unless of course it is not core to the business. So if we are doing content, if we're hiring writers, I have to be very careful about that, because that's what we do. We do content marketing, right? If I'm hiring somebody to implement the peso model, it has to be an employee, it can't be a contractor. But if I'm hiring somebody to help with web development or paid social or PPC, then I can do that, because that's not core to our business.
Right. And the biggest thing to watch out for is, do not make a former employee a contractor, especially right after they were an employee. This is a very popular thing at times to do, particularly when, in the early days before we had remote work as a common thing. So you just had an employee in another state and it was, a pain or something like that. So you would say, okay, well, I'll just have a contractor. Fantastic. Those are the easiest ones for the state authorities to discover, because they're typically filing their business taxes under the same taxpayer identification number as you did payroll. And a lot of states will compare those two lists. And if someone goes off of the employee list with the same entity to being a contractor for that entity, they're going to knock on your door and say, hey, kind of curious. How do you justify this? So, you have to be aware of those kinds of potential sticky situations that may be even outside of what kind of work they're doing. Because even if they're a graphic designer and you don't do graphic design, you could run into problems with that. So you really want to make sure that when you're hiring a contractor, it's truly someone who is committed to being a contractor. They're actually trying to operate a business.
Right.
One of the easiest ways to check on that is, hey, do you have a website? Right? If they've got a website that's got marketing material on it, that goes a long way if you're ever audited, because you can point to it and say, hey, look, they're clearly holding themselves out as being in this business. Ideally, they have an actual business name and you're paying the business name and
Right.
not the individual, right?
Right.
Those are all things that will help. And if you talk to your lawyers and accountants, they will help you on those things. But I don't want to get too tied up in the regulatory piece, because we have talked about that previously on the show. But now it's really a question of, as agencies are looking to the future and trying to figure out, what's my best growth strategy? How do I make sure that I have flexibility to go where I want to go, or maybe where I'm forced to go, particularly with all the talk about a potential recession or other hiccups, concern about, is there going to be another wave of COVID that's going to cause a problem and have some economic fallout? How do I have flexibility? And so a lot of people are saying, hey, let's just hire contractors, because that gives me flexibility. So how do you address that question?
Yeah, certainly a contractor versus an employee does give you flexibility, for sure. And there are lots of consulting firms that have consultants on the bench, so to speak. So it's a good place to look for the structure and the setup for those kinds of things. It is a consulting firm to figure that piece out. Now, you may be paying somebody to quote unquote sit on your bench and not have any work for them. So you have to kind of figure those pieces out too. But for the most part, we tend to look at contractors versus employees in all the areas that we've just discussed, but also look at it from the perspective of, do we have certain projects that have a beginning and an end? So like, for instance, we're doing a podcast tour for a client right now, and it has very specific deliverables. It has a very specific beginning and end. And so we've outsourced that, because that allows us to, for my core team to be able to continue to do the work that they need to do, but have this project that's really focused we've outsourced that to contractors. So I always look at it from that perspective. Is it something that's ongoing and evergreen as part of our retainer, or is it a special project that we need the extra arms and legs for, because we don't have the capacity internally, and it's going to, it lasts 3 months or whatever it happens to be.
Right. Yeah. I think anytime that there is greater uncertainty over the work, that's the best time to have contractors. So whether that's because it's a defined length project, or it's because it's work that you don't typically do and it sort of ebbs and flows within your agency business. So, not to continue to pick on graphic designers, but maybe you only need graphic design work for a couple of days out of the month. It doesn't make sense to hire someone on as an actual employed graphic designer. So that makes sense. Just contract that work out. And so, that kind of work where it ebbs and flows, peaks and valleys, all that kind of stuff, contractors are a great way to give you that kind of flexibility without locking you into the fixed costs associated with an employee.
I also think, there have been several situations in my own business where we've started a certain skill set with a client based on what they need. And it's been, 10 hours a week or 12 hours a week. And so we've outsourced that. But then as it's grown, or we've added that tactical piece to other client work, then it's grown with that contractor, and they've ended up becoming a full-time employee. So they've gone from 10 hours a week or 10 hours a month to 40 hours a week, and then they become a full-time employee. So we've looked at those kinds of project-based to full-time employee opportunities as well. But yeah, I think you're right in that you really look for things that have a defined deliverable or defined length of time. And those are the kinds of things that you can start to outsource.
Yeah, and certainly those kinds of relationships where someone goes from being a contractor to an employee do happen with some degree of regularity. At the same time, I think it's important not to count on it, because I've talked with agency owners who are like, well, I've got a contractor, I'll just make them an employee. That's not a one-way street. You don't get to just say
No.
they're an employee. And I think a lot of folks incorrectly assume that contractors would prefer to be an employee, and many times they don't. Many times contractors are contractors because that's what they want. That's how they want to structure their professional lives.
Yep.
And unfortunately, some states are making it harder for them to make that choice. But we in the agency world shouldn't be adding to that. We should be clear with the contractors that we're working with, how they view things, what's
Absolutely.
their outlook.
Yep.
Just ask them. Let's have conversations. Don't assume things. If ideally you'd like to be able to hire them down the road, tell them sooner rather than later, so that you both know where this thing is headed and is it going to the right place or not. Because if you don't, you're going to run into a lot of uncomfortable conversations, just as, and we've talked about this on the show before, when you think you've got an employee that you'd like to have take over your agency. Well, what if they don't want to do that?
Right.
So just as you shouldn't assume there, don't assume that a contractor would be happy to become an employee if you made them an offer.
Yeah, I think that's really sage advice, because there have been situations with some of my clients in the past where they've just assumed, and then they're like, I don't want to have the conversation and it's uncomfortable. And I'm like, what? Why? Just say, hey, I love the work that you're doing. I love working with you. I can depend on you all the time. At some point, are you interested in working with me full time?
Right.
That's it. There's no conflict to that. That's not a hard conversation to have.
Right. Well, and unfortunately, agency owners, as again we've talked about before, shy away from difficult conversations of all kinds.
Yes.
And it's one of the reasons why a lot of agencies prefer to hire contractors when they can instead of employees, because it helps them, at least in their mind, avoid a potential future difficult conversation if they cannot continue to employ an individual, right? It feels somehow easier to let go of a contractor than to let go of an employee. And I will tell you that this is, in my view, and all the agency owners I've talked to, I'm not sure that's actually true. I've seen a lot of agency owners struggle to cut loose contractors who should be cut loose. So, you still have that human element no matter whether they're a W-2 or a 1099 here in the U.S.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I do think there's something to be said for, especially if you're using contractors for the ebbs and flows. I mean, it's easy to say, the project is over and we loved working with you. We're going to come back to you later when we have something else. That's an easier conversation than having to lay off an employee.
Absolutely.
For sure.
But you went into it with that expectation,
right? Right.
If you have a contractor though that you've got doing 10 hours a week of work for you on a consistent basis, and it's kind of open ended, that's just as difficult a conversation to have with them.
Totally.
Now, the consequences may be less, right? Because with a contractor, generally you can end it almost immediately. You don't have to worry about severance or unemployment benefits or any of those kinds of issues that you have with an employee. But the human component, again, which is, I think more people are concerned about the human component than the all the other stuff.
Right.
Although I have seen some folks get too wound up over unemployment costs if they let an employee go. That's a cost of doing business, right? That's something that you just have to factor into to the work you're doing, and you can't be afraid to lay off or let someone go for non-performance simply because, your unemployment insurance premium may go up.
Right, and it's not even that much. Like, don't Don't let that guide your decision making, because
Yeah, I mean, I will say it does vary substantially from state to state. So some states are much more onerous when it comes to unemployment insurance.
in Illinois, it's not that big of a deal, I would
Yeah,
say.
but
'Cause
in
it's not.
general, whatever it is, you just need to know what it is in your jurisdiction and just factor it into the cost of doing business. But
Yeah, I mean, that's
the
right.
cost of having someone around who you can't afford or who shouldn't be there because of their performance far outweighs any
Yes.
additional cost you might have with UI.
100%. Yeah, I think, it's like anything else. It depends, right? And certainly we're all listening to the news right now, and it's not a pretty sight. And some of us are doom scrolling. I refuse to get on the internet right now, but so I don't doom scroll. But it's not good news out there right now. And I think everybody's looking at it and going, okay, well, if we are going to have a recession or the economy is going to tank, what do I need to do to be prepared? Should I start to lay employees off and transfer them to contractors? Should I hire only contractors? Those conversations are definitely happening right now. So you should be weighing your options for sure. But like you said, you can't take an employee and make them a contractor, and you can't take a contractor and have them do things that an employee would do. And certainly you can't have a contractor working for you 40 hours a week and not doing anything else. So there are lots of things that you should weigh and understand about how this works. And yeah, I mean, we're due for a recession. And if it happens, it happens. But guess what? You're going to survive it. We all survive it. It might not be super fun, but we all just did get through a really bad pandemic. So I think we're going to be okay.
Pandemic? What? I didn't notice there was something went on. But yeah,
no.
I mean, I think listeners know that I am a big fan of contractors in general for giving you that elasticity. And so I believe that you should have a strong bench of contractors. Yes. If you've got one graphic designer, you should definitely have two, because that gives you the ability to, if that contractor is not available for a project or you've got more work in a given time than one individual can handle, it gives you flexibility. So you should absolutely have a very strong contractor bench. At the same time, contractors are not the only answer. They shouldn't be your first stop on everything. There are good reasons why you may want to have an employee instead, because there are advantages to having employees just as there are advantages to having contractors, and you need to know what the right mix is for your business. So I get just as concerned with agencies who are over-reliant on contractors as those that don't use them to the utmost to get that flexibility.
Yeah, and with employees, you do have the flexibility to have things like staff meetings where they're not going to quote unquote charge you like a contractor would. If a contractor comes to a staff meeting that's considered administrative work, they're going to charge you for that because they're required to come to a meeting. So you do have the flexibility to have an employee, if they're not fully utilized from a capacity standpoint, they can work on stuff for the agency. They can do blogging, they can create, work on website updates, they can do some social media. There are things that you can have an employee do during really slow months. Like for most of us right now, the summer months are very slow. They can work on those kinds of things. You can't have a contractor do those kinds of things. So there are pros and cons to both for sure. And I always like to have somebody just write it down. What are the pros to having an employee and what are the cons? What are the pros to having a contractor and what are the cons? And let's figure out what the right mix is.
Right, and with as a good rule of thumb, if you've got a contractor that you're usually using half of their time, that's generally the point where you would almost certainly want to be looking at having that role filled by an employee instead, right? Because typically what you pay a contractor for half of their time is roughly equivalent to what you pay for
100%.
a full-time equivalent employee. And so that then allows you to tap into all of those things that you were just talking about as far as taking advantage of that excess time and excess capacity. And with employees, they're available to you. You don't have to go out and find them and see if they're available when a new client comes in. They're there, what their availability is. Right?
And they can go to new business meetings with you. They can help craft plans. They can help be involved from the beginning. They can help you so that you're not the sole person the client relies on. There's all sorts of pros to it. There's certainly cons as well, but
absolutely. It also helps you to grow, right? So a lot of agencies like the idea of in fact, I've talked to a number of agencies just in the last week or so who are enamored with the idea of building contractor-only agencies, so no employees whatsoever. And I think that those can certainly work, but they tend to have a ceiling on where they can go to, because you need to have people within your agency who can manage accounts and do all the day-to-day stuff that's hard to hand off to a contractor. I mean, if you've got someone who's not really an employee, you got to be careful about saying, okay, they're going to be the person who is the face of our agency. It can work.
Right.
It's not ideal, and it also may run afoul of some of those tests depending on how you're structuring it. So if you're looking to really build some scale into your organization, that's much easier to do with employees than it is for contractors. Contractors are more for the elasticity rather than the ultimate scale.
And I will say too that unless the person, which would in this case have to be an employee, is in it every single day, it's harder. I mean, certainly contractors can do specific things, but they lose the context. They don't, because they're not in it every day. So
Right.
Working with contractors, you have to be really specific about the work that you need them to do, because they're not in your business every day and they don't understand. They're missing nuance and context and all those kinds of things that happen, in daily stand-ups or in weekly staff meetings or things like that. They just miss that. So it takes a different level of management with a contractor than it does an employee.
Yeah, and I think ultimately if people go through the exercise that you described of working through the pros and cons, not for contractors versus employees generally, but for the specific role that you're trying to fill, that will help lead them to the right decision for their agency. And ultimately that's what we all are hoping for, that we make the right decisions at the right time.
Yes, we are. Yes, we are.
And I think my decision right now is that we're going to bring this episode of the Agency Leadership Podcast to a close. I've gone through the pros and cons and
It's time.
decided it's time for me to hit that end recording button. So
I feel like we're on borrowed time because it's been very quiet too. So
yes, so thank you to the kids for cooperating, and thank you all for listening. And with that, I'm Chip Griffin.
I'm Gini Dietrich.
And it depends.